Welcome to the debate. So imagine unearthing an ancient text about a miraculous first century figure. According to the records, he healed the sick, cast out demons. He faced a hostile Roman tribunal and, well, supposedly appeared to his followers after his death.
Right, and if you are hearing this, you probably think you know exactly who we are talking about.
Exactly. But what if that figure wasn't Jesus of Nazareth? What if we are actually talking about a pagan philosopher named Apollonius of Tyana?
The surface-level similarities are honestly striking. I mean, for centuries, historians and theologians have placed these two ancient figures in direct opposition. But the central question we really have to answer today is how we evaluate the surviving documentary evidence.
Right, the core of the debate.
Yeah. Does the textual record prove that Apollonius was a deliberate, late-invented pagan counterpart to Jesus? Or are we taking two fundamentally different ancient biographical traditions and just judging them by entirely unequal standards?
And this debate emerges straight out of the comparative historical and theological source material. My position is that the accounts of Jesus are rooted in historically reliable primary eyewitness testimony. When you put the text side by side, the Apollonius narrative reveals itself as a delayed, intentionally constructed pagan imitation.
Well, and I will argue that evaluating Apollonius purely as a counterfeit Christ completely obscures his distinct philosophical tradition. The biographer who wrote about Apollonius had profoundly different goals that had absolutely nothing to do with offering a path to salvation.
Right, but
calling it a counterfeit, it fundamentally misunderstands how ancient literature worked.
Okay, well, let's start with the historical bedrock, because if we are evaluating reliability, timeline is everything. When historians look at the sources for Jesus of Nazareth, we are dealing with a textual tradition anchored firmly within the living memory of the events.
Right.
The four canonical Gospels were composed roughly between AD 50 and 95. But even before that, we have the Pauline epistles written between, AD 49 and 67?
Which is incredibly close to the actual events, historically speaking. I won't argue that.
Exactly. And within those epistles, Paul is not just writing down his own ideas. He preserves oral traditions and creeds that predate his letters. Look at 1 Corinthians 15. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day."
And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Yeah, that is a highly formalized creedal structure.
It is. In a largely illiterate ancient Near Eastern culture, information was preserved through rhythmic, easily memorized oral transmission. Scholars date that specific creed to within just 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion. It was circulating while the eyewitnesses were actively walking around Jerusalem.
Okay, but
furthermore, we don't just rely on Christian texts. We have hostile, non-Christian corroboration.
And this is where we have to be careful about what those hostile sources are actually confirming.
Well, let's break down how they function. Take the Roman historian Tacitus, writing around AD 116. Tacitus absolutely despised Christians. He called them a class hated for their abominations. As a hostile Roman elite, he has zero incentive to validate any Christian claim.
Right, he hated them.
Exactly. Yet in his annals, he explicitly records that Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. That hostile corroboration is the gold standard for ancient historians. Or take the Babylonian Talmud, which accuses Jesus of practicing sorcery.
Wait, hold on. Why is a charge of sorcery a point in favor of historical reliability?
Because of what it doesn't say. The Talmud doesn't deny that Jesus performed supernatural wonders. It attempts to reattribute the source of his power to dark magic.
Ah, I see.
Right? That is an indirect admission from fierce theological opponents that his miracles were widely acknowledged facts. Now, contrast all of that primary, hostile, verified evidence with Apollonius of Tyana.
Look, the timeline is different. I don't think any serious historian disputes that.
Different is an understatement. The primary source for the life of Apollonius is a biography written by Philostratus around AD 220. That is more than 120 to 150 years after Apollonius supposedly died. And Philostratus didn't write this organically. He was heavily compensated by the Empress Julia Domna.
We need to explain why Julia Domna commissioned this work, though, because it goes to the very heart of my argument. She wasn't just sitting around looking for a way to troll early Christians.
No, she had a massive vested political interest.
Exactly.
The Severan dynasty was trying to unify a fracturing Roman Empire, and she wanted to promote a unified pagan alternative to the rising, highly organized tide of Christianity. So, if you are listening to this and wondering why a 150-year gap matters, if Apollonius truly performed these magnificent wonders, if he truly raised the dead, how do you explain the absolute silence for a century and a half?
Well, the silence only matters if you are looking for the footprint of a mass populist religion. You are holding Apollonius to a standard he was never trying to meet.
How so?
Philostratus portrays a teacher of elite esoteric philosophy. We are talking about a neo-Pythagorean. Let's define what that actually looked like in practice for the audience, because it's important.
Right. So a neo-Pythagorean in the first century was someone committed to extreme moral asceticism. Apollonius demanded absolute vegetarianism, abstained from wine entirely, wore only linen because animal products like leather or wool were considered impure, and he required a strict vow of silence from his inner circle for 5 years.
Which is hardly a recipe for a massive, immediate global movement.
Exactly. When Jesus died, the Christian ecclesia, the early church, exploded across the Mediterranean because the core message demanded universal evangelism. Go and make disciples of all nations. Apollonius wasn't offering a soteriological message.
Meaning salvation?
Right. By soteriological, I mean a doctrine of salvation. He wasn't claiming to be a savior of the world, he wasn't offering atonement for humanity's sins, and he wasn't preaching a coming kingdom. He was an itinerant sage for the philosophical elite. So of course there isn't a massive first-century footprint. Yeah, I will readily concede that Damas is almost certainly a literary invention. But we have to deal with the reality of ancient historiography. Using a fictional narrator or, discovering a lost diary was a standard framing device in Greco-Roman literature to give a narrative structure to a collection of teachings.
Sure, as a framing device.
Admitting Domus as a framing device doesn't automatically mean the core philosophical traditions attributed to Apollonius was fabricated out of thin air. We know Apollonius existed. We have letters attributed to him that actually predate Philostratus.
Having a few letters about asceticism is one thing, but inventing a narrator to frame a biography completely alters how we evaluate the massive supernatural claims made in that text. If Damas is fake, the eyewitness testimony to Apollonius's miracles is fake, which brings us directly to this stark theological contrast in how these two figures are portrayed.
You're talking about the nature of the miracles themselves.
Yes, absolutely. The miracles of Jesus as presented in the Gospels serve a highly specific theological purpose. They aren't random magic tricks. The text calls them simia, signs. They point directly to his divine identity and his mission. Look at the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11.
Well, John is arguably the most fiercely theological text of the 4 Gospels.
It is, but look at how grounded the claim is. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. The text doesn't shy away from precise geographical and personal details. Martha, Mary, the village of Bethany. It even notes the visceral detail that the body already smelled of decay.
Right.
The claim is unambiguous. Jesus speaks, the dead man walks out. And regarding Jesus' own resurrection, Paul doesn't vaguely allude to a spirit. He cites over 500 witnesses who saw him bodily. Paul is essentially daring his readers in Corinth to go interview these people because most of them were still alive.
And you are going to contrast that with the funeral in Rome?
I have to, because the contrast is devastating. The most famous miracle attributed to Apollonius is the raising of a young bride at her funeral in Rome. Even Philostratus, the author who is literally being paid to elevate Apollonius, aggressively hedges his bets.
He's being cautious.
He writes, quote, whether he detected some spark of life in her which had escaped those who were attending to her, or whether life had really been extinguished and he restored it by the warmth of his touch, remains a mystery. Philostratus admits he doesn't actually know if the girl was dead.
Okay, but you are pointing to that ambiguity as a weakness, a crack in the forgery. I actually argue that this very equivocation proves the text is not a direct, engineered counterfeit of the Gospels.
Wait, how does admitting your hero might have just woken up a sleeping girl help your case?
Think about the mechanics of propaganda. If Philostratus was deliberately commissioned by the empress to write a fake gospel to compete with the rising Christian church, why would he hedge on his hero's greatest miracle? If you are writing a counterfeit, you make the counterfeit perfect. You write an unambiguous, triumphant resurrection story that just blows Lazarus out of the water.
So you're saying the hesitation implies a different genre altogether?
Precisely. The gospel writers make unambiguous claims because their goal is explicitly salvation. John states his thesis plainly. These have been written so that you may believe, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
Right.
Philostratus isn't trying to save your soul. His equivocation about the spark of life reflects the ancient medical understanding of catalepsy and a very cautious philosophical approach. He is exploring whether Apollonius possessed immense medical intuition or actual supernatural power, and he leaves the final judgment to the reader. That is the hallmark of a distinct pagan literary tradition, not some sloppy copy of the New Testament.
Okay, that is a very generous reading of Philostratus, but it completely ignores the ultimate miracle, Apollonius's own post-mortem appearance. If he wasn't competing with Christianity, why include a resurrection at all?
Well, let's look at how that resurrection actually happens.
Exactly. It happens to a single disciple who was doubting the immortality of the soul. Apollonius appears to him in a dream to settle the philosophical dispute. There is no bodily resurrection, there is no empty tomb, there is no public vindication before the Roman authorities. It is a completely internalized, private vision.
Which perfectly aligns with Neo-Pythagorean philosophy. They believed the flesh was a temporary prison for the soul. A bodily resurrection would be a philosophical downgrade for a Pythagorean.
A downgrade?
Yes. Appearing as an unbound spirit in a dream is the ultimate proof of his philosophy. To say he didn't resurrect the Christian way, therefore it's a failed counterfeit, completely ignores what Apollonius was actually trying to prove.
The problem with treating the text as just an independent philosophical exercise is the deliberate structural mirroring present in the broader narrative. The text actively appropriates and twists the established Christian framework. The structural parallels are just too precise to be an accident. Let's look at the birth narratives.
Both feature divine announcements. That is a standard trope for any major figure in antiquity, from Alexander the Great to Augustus.
But look at how it's done. Jesus' birth is announced by the archangel Gabriel, a named messenger of the one true God. And it fulfills centuries of highly specific Hebrew prophecies. Micah 5:2 names Bethlehem centuries in advance. Isaiah 53 details the atoning death. Psalm 22 describes the piercing of hands and feet long before crucifixion was even invented by the Persians.
Sure.
Jesus steps into a pre-existing, historically verifiable prophetic matrix. Apollonius fulfills no prior prophetic tradition whatsoever. And who announces his birth to his mother?
An apparition of Proteus.
The Egyptian sea demon from Homeric myth. Think about what Proteus represents to a Greek reader. Proteus is a pagan deity known strictly for deception, illusion, and changing his shape to avoid being captured. The very name carries the connotation of mutability and deceit.
It also carries the connotation of ancient, hidden knowledge. Proteus knew all things past, present, and future if you could hold on to him.
But you can't ignore the shape-shifting aspect because it explains perfectly how the text functions. The Apollonius narrative is mutable. It is a shape-shifting literary creation designed by the 3rd century imperial court to mimic and subvert the Christian narrative whenever it needs to.
I think that's a stretch.
Well, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 warns about exactly this. He says Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. The Greek word Paul uses is metaschematizatai, which literally means to transform one's outward shape.
Okay, but
Apollonius fits the biblical warning of the pseudo-Christoi, the false Christs, with remarkable precision. He is presented with the outward appearance of divine wisdom, an austere lifestyle, but it's a counterfeit designed to subtly lead people back toward the pantheon of pagan gods.
Let me stop you right there, because this is where the historical analysis falls apart into theological retrojection. You are taking a very specific Christian theological lens, 2 Corinthians 11, and the concept of a demonic shape-shifting counterfeit, and applying it backward onto a Greco-Roman text to explain its existence.
I am applying it because the historical timeline fits perfectly. Christianity was threatening the Roman order, and Rome manufactured a philosopher to compete.
But the text itself resists that categorization. If Apollonius was engineered to be a false Christ, why does he constantly reject the trappings of a god?
What do you mean?
When he visits the Brahmins in India and sees them performing levitation and using self-moving magical tripods to serve food, Philostratus explicitly notes that Apollonius disclaimed any wish to imitate them. He finds their flashy magic distasteful. Does that sound like the engineered hero of a false gospel designed to dazzle the masses away from Jesus?
I mean,
It sounds exactly like what it is. A stoic, neo-Pythagorean, prioritizing moral discipline over magical spectacle.
well, you bring up the Brahmins in India, which is actually the perfect example of the cracks in this fabricated foundation. You say he rejected their magic, but you're leaving out the glaring inconsistency that the early church father Eusebius seized upon.
Ah, you're referring to Eusebius's treatise against Hierocles.
Yes, Eusebius brilliantly points out the internal contradictions. Apollonius supposedly finds the Brahmins' magic distasteful, yet in the same narrative, he happily accepts 7 magical star rings from those very same Brahmins, rings imbued with mysterious planetary powers that he wears on alternating days of the week.
Well, sure, magic was...
And it gets worse. Philostratus claims Apollonius had a divine mind that allowed him to understand all human languages without ever learning them. Yet a few chapters later, Philostratus forgets his own premise and admits Apollonius had to use an interpreter to speak to the Indian king Phraates.
Look, those are biographical inconsistencies. You can find textual tensions in almost any ancient document.
They aren't just minor quirks. They prove the text is an artificial assembly. The narrative was constructed over a century after the fact by a paid author who couldn't keep his own miraculous claims straight. Look at the ultimate historical results. Jesus Christ founded a community that endured intense Roman persecution, transformed civilizations, and preserved primary eyewitness accounts in the face of torture.
That is true.
Apollonius left no lasting community. There was no underground neo-Pythagorean church willing to be fed to the lions for the truth of his resurrection. The narrative was sustained entirely by imperial fiat, not by devoted followers testifying to a truth they had witnessed.
I don't disagree that the historical footprint of Jesus is vastly larger, and the documentary proximity of the New Testament is objectively closer to the events. The martyrdom of the early church is an undeniable historical reality.
Right.
But the fact that Christianity won the historical numbers game doesn't mean Apollonius was a demonic forgery. The actual weaponization of Apollonius didn't happen when Philostratus wrote the book. It happened decades later.
You're talking about Sassianus Hierocles.
Yes. At the very end of the 3rd century, Hierocles was a Roman governor deeply involved in the persecution of Christians. He was the one who wrote the anti-Christian polemic Lover of Truth, explicitly placing Apollonius and Jesus side by side to mock the Christians.
Exactly. He used him as a club.
He did. Hierocles said, look, our guy did miracles too, and we don't worship him as a god. You guys are foolish for worshiping a crucified carpenter. That provoked Eusebius to write his systematic refutation. But we cannot take the political weaponization of Apollonius by a 3rd century governor and claim that was the original intent of the tradition itself. To do so strips the ancient pagan world of its own agency and organic philosophical development.
But we have to evaluate what the text actually is, regardless of who weaponized it later. When we look at the evidence, the unique primary source reliability of the Jesus narrative stands utterly apart. We have multiple independent 1st century attestations. We have hostile confirmations from Roman and Jewish historians. We have a vast network of fulfilled prophetic heritage, and we have a radically public, historically disruptive resurrection.
And on the other side, we have a fascinating window into late antiquity.
We have a late, ideologically driven literary creation.
We have a biographer who casts doubt on his own subject's miracles, a fictional narrator in Damas, and a resurrection that is nothing more than a solitary dream about the immortality of the soul. The contrast is absolute. We are not just looking at two different philosophical traditions. We are looking at the difference between historical reality and an artificially manufactured political narrative.
Well, we will clearly continue to disagree on the foundational intent behind Philostratus' text. You see a deliberate, intentional pagan mimicry designed from its inception to subvert the Gospels. I see a distinct, internally consistent philosophical tradition that was only later weaponized by polemicists.
Fair enough.
Philosophical biography and religious authority actually functioned in the Greco-Roman world outside of a Christian framework. Apollonius represents an entirely different currency of ancient thought, one focused on elite moral discipline and localized wisdom, not global salvation.
But there is tremendous value in examining these ancient debates. When we place these figures side by side, it forces us to interrogate the evidence. There is much more to explore in the source material regarding how early historians evaluated claims of the supernatural, how textual transmission works, and how societies construct the biographies of their most revered figures.
Absolutely. It forces us to ask how we weigh evidence when dealing with the ancient world. How do we understand the motives of ancient authors? And, well, perhaps most importantly, how deeply do our own modern retroactive frameworks color the history we read?
Which brings us right back to where we started. When you unearth these two figures from antiquity and hold them up to the light, what are you looking at? Are you looking at two distinct currencies from two entirely different realms of ancient thought? Or are you looking at a genuine historical reality and a carefully crafted shapeshifter designed to replace it? The evidence is there to be examined.
Until next time.